Hello, and welcome to Sacred Herbalism, the full moon segment of the Elder Tree podcast, where we explore how plants can support us to enter into a sacred relationship with life and the living world. I'm Stephanie Hazel, and I've recorded this episode beneath the gaze of epic Wollumbin, where I live in Bundjalung country, and I pay my respects to the First Nations people of this land, as well as to the spirits and plants of this ancient earth. If you love what we do, you can support the Elder Tree mission of putting medicine in the hands of the people by joining our Patreon, where you can access special teachings from our presenters and our interviewees. So, let's walk into the moonlit forest together. Are you ready? Hello and welcome to this month's Sacred Herbalism episode, and this is a year in review. So I really think about each segment of this podcast like a long form conversation with many different voices, and I know that in the Sacred Herbalism segment there are lots of different themes and motifs that emerge repeatedly, and each time we have a guest that speaks about that, I feel like we flesh out a little extra nuance of that theme, and I'm sure the other segments are similar in that way too. Something that is definitely present here is that when we are speaking about sacred herbalism, about plant listening, about plant intelligence, animism, plants as collaborators, not commodities, we're really sitting at the edge of the speakable. It is hard to articulate some of these more numinous ways of being in relationship with plants, of being with plants in a way that puts them in a position of equality and awareness rather than passivity and object. It's hard to language these things well and clearly because our culture doesn't really support these ways of seeing plants. Our language forms so much of how we think about the world and how we are able to think about things outside the box. But when we're grasping for new forms of language in this kind of conversation, I think we're also reweaving how our mind sees life. So that's definitely been a challenge that occurs again and again in this podcast, finding new words, finding new language, finding stories and metaphors to point to things that are hard to articulate clearly. The irony of me stumbling over articulate clearly. So I hope that you, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, that you have found new words or new ways to think about plants through this journey with me and all the beautiful guests that we've had. I'm going to pull out some of the key themes that seem to be emerging again and again for me. And one of them that I find really interesting is this idea of the practice of sacred herbalism. So sacred herbalism being a practice of being in relationship with plants and actively trying to engage with them as collaborators, as aware beings, as having a relationship with us. The practice of sacred herbalism being a technology for cultural repair. I think most of us can agree that there are some ways that our culture has really drifted from a path that feels authentic and whole and healthy. I don't think our culture is completely off the rails, but I do think that there is a cultural drift that's happened, and for me that centers around the capitalist commodification of all beings and this sense of humans being somehow completely isolated and separate from the living world. Not just separate, but the only ones with agency. Now, it might feel like a powerful place to sit, but actually it's a very lonely place to sit because it locates us inside a dead universe. And the burden of meaning and world making is entirely on our shoulders, especially as we hit this point in our human history where it feels like many crises are looming and maybe the choices we've made haven't been so great. If you no longer trust the human societies to make good and healthy choices, then it can be a very dismal place if we don't also feel like there are other beings and other forces at play. So for some people, they trust in God or in their religion, and that probably supports them a lot to feel more at ease in the world. But I think for those of us on this segment, on this podcast, there is a tantalizing possibility and invitation that has emerged through the many episodes. That we can see sacred herbalism as a technology or a method for cultural repair, and almost by belonging ourselves to the earth again, there's some repair that happens in our conceptions of humans and ourselves and our place in life. Alongside this idea of cultural repair is this feeling of ancestral grief, and the grief that many of us hold as we return or turn our awareness back to a wild and reverent relationship with life and with plants. There is the grief of all that has been lost, the wisdom, the connection and the sense of belonging that we feel that our ancestors used to have. Now, as the children of colonialism, which many of us are, and many of my guests that I've interviewed have either been white Australians or some white Americans as well. So all of these complex histories of colonialism, oppression, disconnection, and grief. There's of course a tension here. As we yearn to reclaim our ancestral traditions and to belong ourselves to the land, there's a tension that we need to make sure we are not appropriating from other cultures who have been dispossessed of many things, and that we are sitting with some awareness of what has been lost across the board in the land that we are sitting in. I don't know how to resolve that tension, but I feel I need to name it in this space as well. So Kimberly Kling in this episode, American herbalist, she speaks about using weeds and working with invasive plants as a metaphor for cultural displacement, and for how, as the children of colonization, we can make peace with how we are sitting on the land. With my episode with Daisy Devine, she speaks about trauma, but also about how herbalism is a cultural and ecological right of return. That by engaging with plants, we are returning to a more interconnected way of being, a culture of collaboration. With Jimmy Wallumbin, we speak a lot about trusting the wildness of the world and shifting our sense of trust away from the institutions that many of us no longer trust. The hospitals, the government, the media. Honestly, it can be very difficult to know who to trust in this world these days. And there's a question emerging here in this segment, which is, can we return our sense of trust to the wildness of the world, to the ecosystemic intelligence of Gaia? Embedded inside this idea of sacred herbalism as cultural repair is this recurring theme throughout all the episodes of this podcast, all the episodes of this segment anyway, that sees plants as collaborators and not commodities. This is a huge cultural shift, right? And again, that language piece is really important. So I had two conversations about business and how we do this inside business. One with Monica Francia, who has a herb farm in Tasmania, and the other is Mason Taylor, who's the owner of Superfeast, which is an online herbal extract company. They import a lot of herbs from China, dealing a lot of Chinese herbs. Now, both of them were talking about how do we do business where we are literally trading the herbs as commodities? How do we do that business and still engage with the plants in that reverent and reciprocal way? And I think that there was more questions and answers in those episodes. But one thing that came through was remembering to have our own personal practice of plant connection, of reverence, of collaborating with the plants, of gratitude, and just being careful that the plants are being harvested responsibly, that they're being grown in a way that supports soil, that supports this ecosystemic intelligence we were just speaking about. If we're going to locate our trust in the ecosystemic intelligence of Gaia and the intelligence of plants, then we need to be respecting that intelligence in the way that we trade plants and grow plants as well. Rachel White's and Sky Cielita Floor were two conversations that happened back to back, and they were both deeply animistic. These are both women who are practicing animist arts in their lives, and they're actually really good friends. And with both of these, that animism was proposed as a way, a philosophical framework for engaging with the earth as alive and the plants as having a living awareness, having intelligence of their own, not just being passive beings, right? So Rachel spoke a lot about healing trauma with animism, that a lot of our psychological trauma can be healed through renewing our kinship to the natural world. And this idea that plants are interested in helping us do that, that plants recognize us and can speak with us and can help us to feel whole again through the way that they are in deeper relationship with the rest of the ecosystem. They can always be teachers for us to remember how to be present and interconnected in an easy and heart-filled way. Sky and I spoke a lot about Stephen Harabuna's work, who is that amazing animist, earth poet, herbalist who passed away, I think, 2 years ago. And we speak a lot about his book, Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm, which is basically the textbook for this kind of work. And there we really start to see plants as being really alive and aware and talking to us. Individual plants, not just the plant of calendula, but like that calendula that lives in that corner of my garden, having an awareness that is sometimes open to communicating with me. Of course, that not all plants want to talk to all people, right? It's easy to put humans in the center of that story again and say, oh, well, if plants are animist, if plants are aware and alive, and then they're all just waiting there for a person to come and talk to them. But of course, that's not true. They have their own agendas, and that's a theme that's come out through this last year as well. This idea of plants having not just an intelligence, but their own agenda for what is unfolding on the earth and what is unfolding in this little corner of the earth. It's worth bringing my conversation with Miriam Latif into this part, this thread as well. With Miriam, we spoke a lot about the problems with wellness culture, the pursuit of purity as being a kind of disconnective practice. It disconnects us from the world, and her work is really engaged with unpacking the narratives of wellness culture. And in a way, most wellness culture is really continuing this story of optimization, of taking what we need from the environment, from the earth, to fix the human in this very mechanistic way. And it's very different from this idea of herbalist as facilitator of deep relationship with plants and with earth, right? In that way, the herbalist is a guide, and the plants are actually the core agent of healing, rather than the plants being a commodity where we're extracting this magic ingredient that we can then be these magicians or these mechanics and magically fix people's problems to get them performing at a highest level. Many people throughout this year have spoken about listening to plants, and I know I speak about it a lot as well, so maybe that's why. But this idea that sitting in silence can be a portal to hearing another voice speaking, to hearing communication from the plant world, is a potent one, and one that recurs throughout the last year. All the way back in last September, Marianne Housing, the Dutch herbalist I interviewed, she spoke about tree listening. She's a tree listener, and sitting on the land here in Australia and listening to camphor laurels and what they have to say. Heidi Wedd spoke about listening to flowers, listening to calendula. Jimmy Wallumbin talked about the way that plants can choose to reveal themselves to us in dreams and what it means to pay attention to that. Tennille, our presenter on the permaculture segment of this podcast, we had a beautiful conversation about the magic of gardening, and she spoke about communicating with the plants in your garden and engaging with the plants that you don't want as well, moving this cycad because she just could hear that cycad wanted to be there, and talking to the cycad and telling that cycad that if you don't flower, if you don't grow any new leaves, we're going to have to pull you out, and then it finally growing a new leaf that next day, you know. This idea that we can listen to plants, but also maybe plants listen to us. Kimberly Kling spoke about listening to weeds and listening to rose. And the themes that are emerging there are this idea of deep listening. So listening from a place of meditative silence and stillness. This idea that plants can be teachers. that we can hear things that help us on our journey, both as herbalists and as people. And that this is rooted in this idea of coevolution, that humans and plants have evolved together. And so there is a capacity for communication because of this long, long history of plant connection. And then probably the last point in here is the idea of intuitive knowledge and intuitive listening, and how we use our intuitive sense to be able to hear what the plants are saying. That it's not hearing with our ears, of course, but it's images and sensations and thoughts and ideas that are being, I guess, kind of telepathically communicated. And I'm definitely a big advocate for honing our intuition as a skill, not just wholesale acceptance of every flight of fancy that might cross our imagination. Although I think when we're starting, it's good just to accept everything as real and later get better at refining. But, practicing in groups, this idea of how we listen to plants, how we hone our intuitive awareness to be able to discern the difference between imagination and plant communication. So I know that Sky Celia Floor, she runs groups of plant listening. In all my courses, we do that as a group, and we had that feedback to help us refine what we are interpreting as being real from plants and from our own imagination. So yes, listening to plants and the non-human intelligence that plants hold is a big theme in this segment for the last year, and I think from the beginning. The final theme I want to explore here is this idea of healing beyond the physical, that plants are not just a medicine for our bodies, even though herbalism is currently mainly seen in that way, that this plant affects our lungs in this way, or this plant affects our adrenals in this way. But many, many people at the moment are seeking a kind of spiritual healing, a soul healing, a psycho-emotional mental health healing, if you will. And I do believe, and many of my guests affirm and reinforce, that herbalism is a powerful tool for this kind of soul healing, mental wellness, emotional healing, trauma healing, right? And a lot of these plants, we can access this healing once we are in relationship with them. That's my experience. When we are in a relationship with the plants, when we've done plant listening with that plant, when we've offered our reverence and our attention, then it's easier as a practitioner to firstly understand what kind of soul wound that herb can support with, and then also I get better results with the plants I've done that with. This ties back to lots of curanderismo ideas and lots of ancient indigenous ways of being with plants, this idea that a plant goes into relationship or into partnership with a healer, and that once that plant is in partnership with the healer, they can use that effectively to heal all kinds of things. So some of the episodes that spoke about this healing beyond the physical, I think the two really obvious ones would be Daisy K. Devine about Taoist use of plants for healing trauma. And in that episode, Daisy spoke a lot about working with the gut and the nervous system to support the integration of trauma in the body, getting out of the story of the trauma and just going to how it lodges in the body. And some of the plants that we spoke about there were passion flower, lemon balm, reishi, and blue lily as being some of the herbs that can help with that. And with Rachel Weitz, we talked more directly about healing trauma through giving people or helping people find a sense of being in relationship and connected to the plant world. And I think a lot of us, because of the cultural issues we were talking about at the beginning of this episode, there's all of these sense of being disconnected, that we can't trust the institutions that are around us, that we don't trust that humans are going in a good direction, that there's a lot of fear and anxiety about the future and the state of the earth and the state of human culture. That in itself, all that anxiety and that lack of trust and that displacement from the ecosystems of humans causes a lot of trauma in and of itself. It causes a schism inside our psyche that is able to be supported physically through the bodies of the plants, taking them as medicine, but also through helping our clients and ourselves feel that connection. I find there's something very powerful in clinic when I hand over a herb, and it's easier with a single herb. I hand over a herb with a story that speaks to the soul message of that plant, If I've matched it well to the client, if I've picked it well, I can tell when I tell the story, something shimmers and settles and relaxes in that person. And when I give them the invitation that they can receive that herb, they can receive their medicine, taking it into their mouth in the mornings, with a little remembering of the beauty that there are plants in the world making medicine out of sunlight and water, that just happen, or perhaps intentionally happen to connect with receptors in their bodies that can support healing, and just to connect with the wonder of that, and let every time you take a herb be a reminder of your belonging on this earth. Handing over herbs in that way, whether or not you're working with mental health, whether or not you're working with soul wounds, whether or not you're animist, handing a herb over in that way is a beautiful invitation and very healing in and of itself. And most people are more receptive than you might think. Embedded in this theme of healing beyond the physical is another idea of collective grief, collective trauma, and collective healing. This idea that burnout, grief, addiction, depression, anxiety, they're not personal failings, but systemic problems. They're systemic responses to the broader cultural issues we're talking about. This idea went hand in hand with another idea that healing is also relational, that when we can be in community with each other, when we can be in community with the plants, with the earth, when we can work with herbs as being alive and resonant and intelligent and participatory, when we can listen to the earth and in doing so listen to ourselves, that there's a kind of collective shift towards healing that happens. I think it's a really beautiful spot to end. It ties into Miriam's conversation and issues with the wellness culture really forcing a narrative of personal warriorhood, in a way, not her words, my words, where each individual is striving for optimization, and that any healing is our personal failing of not doing our work, etc. This is a really nice point to end on, because here in this podcast, we are unpacking and relanguaging concepts that are hard to work on, hard to untangle, but are potentially an important part of the collective healing of many of us and where we're sitting in our challenging places, collective healing of our global culture, a return to deeper listening, a return to interconnectedness and interdependence with the plant world and with each other. So thank you so much for being a part of this podcast journey. Would absolutely love to hear any of your thoughts of what in this conversation, this emerging conversation, has been touching you, what you think is missing, what have I not seen, who should be on here next, and any questions you have for unpacking and exploring are so welcome. You can email me at herbalist@stephaniehazel.com.au. I'd love to hear from you. Happy full moon. That's it for this moon cycle. Thanks for joining me in another layer of this fascinating conversation we are having about the role of the sacred in our lives as herbalists. If you know someone who would love this episode, then send it through to them, as our work strengthening our herbal community through grassroots herbal education starts right here. I'll see you next time the moon is round in the sky, and until then, I wish you good health and many plants.